tonight on Primetime Politics, raising an alarm.
And we know that Donald Trump is there to undermine us at every step of the way.
Charlie Angus returns to Ottawa, issuing a warning about the U.S. president and Donald Trump's upcoming visit to Canada. Coming up, we'll hear what the former NDP MP is calling on Canadians to do. Also,
we cannot expand oil and gas production if we have an emissions cap.
the Alberta Premier lets it be known she is talking to oil companies looking to find a backer for a new pipeline to the West Coast. But will British Columbia be on board? Coming up, we'll speak to BC radio host Jas Johal about the appetite for pipelines in the province. And how the Prime Minister is causing controversy with his guest list for the G7. This is Primetime Politics. Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Serapio. Well, in just a matter of days, the U.S. president will be attending the G7 here in Canada, but former MP Charlie Angus is none too happy about that fact. Returning to the Hill today to amplify what he's been talking about since leaving Parliament, the threat he says Donald Trump represents for Canada, for democracy, and for the rule of law. Evidence, says Angus, by Trump's decision to send the U.S. National Guard into Los Angeles, a move that allows U.S. officials to carry out raids and deportations despite public protest. Here's what the California governor is saying about Trump's move.
Authoritarian regimes begin by targeting people who are least able to defend themselves, but they do not stop there. Trump and his loyalists, they thrive on division because it allows them to take more power and exert even more control. And by the way, Trump, he's not opposed to lawlessness and violence as long as it serves him. What more evidence do we need than January 6th?
Well, happy to say that Charlie Angus joins us in studio this evening. Charlie, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So here you have this news conference. You lay out this searing indictment of Donald Trump. You liken him to other authoritarian figures. You call him a threat. But, ultimately, the G7 is an economic gathering of democratic countries. The United States is the world's largest economy. It is also right now a democracy. Why wouldn't Donald Trump be in Kananaskis?
The United States is no longer a democracy. This is an authoritarian regime. I think there's an incredible naivety about dealing with Donald Trump. And I'm not blaming anyone for it, but we're dealing with in completely uncharted territory. Donald Trump has made clear again and again that he doesn't believe in the international rule of law. He supported Vladimir Putin relentlessly while undermining the Europeans. He's threatened Canada. He says that we don't have a right to exist. So we're dealing with an autocrat who sees us as a inclusive, diverse, equity-promoting country as a threat. I'm not saying that Prime Minister Carney is going to block Donald Trump at the border. I think that would escalate things dramatically. But we need to start talking much more clearly about the threat to democracy that is happening in the United States, because it's a threat to Canada and it's a threat to the world at this point.
Okay, you say we. Does that mean you expect those discussions to be had around the table between all the G7 leaders? Or are you talking about Canadians, while the world's attention is on Kananaskis, to be talking in one voice about this? What are you actually referring to there? Well,
one of the things that's really struck me since Donald Trump became elected, I think ordinary Canadians have stepped up. I think we were sleepwalking. I think Canada was sleepwalking to a mega-like disaster prior to Trump's election. But I talked to people from across Canada. The boycott has been an unprecedented powerhouse in terms of putting pressure on American states and putting pressure on supporters of Trump. I mean, $12 billion in vacation travel gone out the window. American wine sales to Canada down 90-some%. Canadians, I think, understand the threat. But what worries me is that we have this ability of sort of talking about Donald as though he's, oh, it's Donald, who he just says stuff. It's going to go, it's just him being him, when he's been very clear in his attacks on democracy, his attacks on the European allies. What I would like to see is that the Prime Minister works with our European allies, and I'm not here to undermine the Prime Minister at this point. I think it's all hands on deck for Canada. I don't think our premiers are stepping up the way they should be. I think some of them are actively undermining us. But we as a nation really need to be thinking bigger than just saying, well, maybe the budget will have something for Alberta, and maybe the budget will have something here. We need to be looking at how does Canada reposition itself in a world of gangster regimes. Maybe some of that will happen at the G6, and I say G6 because Donald Trump will be coming, I think, as a disruptor. We have to start building those links with the other countries.
Okay, building links for other countries, building resiliency is another way that people are putting it. But, you know, at the end of the day, though, the United States still is this country's closest and only geographically connected neighbor. At some point, we're going to have to figure out how to work still with the United States, or do you disagree with that premise?
I think what's really concerning here is, I mean, we've been neighbors, we've been friends, we've been intermarried, you know, people travel back and forth across the borders. Well, the border is now a threat. When I talk to university professors in Canada who are told by their administrations they have to bring burner phones if they're going to cross the border. I mean, that's what happens when you go to North Korea. When we see people being arbitrarily detained and kidnapped, this is a country now outside of the rule of law. What's very concerning for Canada is that we live along the border. We live along the border with a country that we've never had to worry about, but now we have to worry. I think it's better to be talking about this and talking about this in the frank manner that we need to. This man is a threat to democracy. This man doesn't believe Canada has a right to exist. This man cheered on Vladimir Putin and said it was wonderful when he seized Ukrainian territory. I think Donald Trump thought we were pushovers. I thought he probably thought we were chumps, and we've shown that we aren't chumps. But it's really, really important that we maintain very strong vigilance. Maybe there will be a point that we come back to a better place. We're not going to come back to that place if America loses the rule of law and we see the rise of authoritarianism. We will not ever be able to come back at that point. But at this point, things are still in flux, and people are looking to Canada. From around the world, people look to Canada right now because it's a fragile line we're holding, but we're holding the line.
Yeah, fragile line, but it's also a fragile relationship because, you know, to get back to the point I'm making, at the end of the day, the United States is this country's largest trading partner. You know, up until the disruption of boycotts and tariffs, you know, the United States was where Canada was integrating the economy. There's going to be an element of that one way or the other going forward. Don't you agree?
Well, absolutely, we have to find a way forward. But I think the worst thing we could do would be to tiptoe around the threat. Maybe the best thing that Prime Minister Trudeau ever did in his 9 years in office was when Donald Trump threatened those outrageous tariffs that the Prime Minister came back and said, we will go dollar for dollar. Because Americans need to feel the pain. The damage that they're doing to our auto sector, if we tiptoe around, we're going to see the steady bleed off of auto sector jobs, which will destroy the manufacturing centers along the 401 corridor. But if we go pound for pound, dollar for dollar, then that pressure is on in the United States. Again, going back to the boycott, we see that, you know, some key MAGA leaders and senators are now calling for Donald Trump to back off because of the Canadian pressure. So we have to negotiate with determination. It is insane, the attack that he's launched on aluminum. I mean, this is an industry that exists across borders. Agriculture, $70 billion in cross-border trade. It's causing havoc in the United States right now. They are suffering, I would say, they are probably starting to suffer more than we are. And we have to hold that. And maybe we get back to a place where the tariffs come off, and maybe we get back to a place where we can start to rethink how steel, how aluminum, how agriculture cross the border because we are neighbors. But right now, we are dealing with a malignant threat.
Okay, I'm quickly losing time here, but I do have to ask, Kananaskis just a few days away, are you going to be involved in any protests during that meeting?
I will not be out there for protests, but I encourage every Canadian to step up. I encourage every Canadian to support the June 14th rallies. We have to be out in the streets. We have to send a message to our leaders, provincial and federal, that we deeply oppose the fact that a convicted criminal, a sexual predator, and a man who says our country doesn't have a right to exist is now visiting our nation. So I encourage people to go out and protest peacefully across this country, and I think you'll see Canadians out in big numbers.
You know, right now, your party, your former party, is going to be holding a leadership race. Are you going to run again?
I have I still have the T-shirts and the buttons from running before, and it was a great experience. But we do need to rebuild the party. We do need to rebuild social democracy. So I'm looking forward to hearing what plans there will be to actually rebuild a social democratic movement in this country after the disaster of that last election.
Charlie Angus, thanks for the time.
Thank you.
Well, to the Alberta Premier now, as Danielle Smith made it known today that her government is now in talks with oil companies, hoping to secure a proposal that would see a new pipeline built from Alberta to the West Coast, a project that the Western Premier said they backed when they met last month in Yellowknife.
I and, of course, the other premiers have been vocal that Western and Arctic resource corridors should be treated as nation-building projects. But we need to maintain the pressure to ensure policies are in place to support new infrastructure on a large scale, because we cannot build a pipeline to the West Coast if there is a tanker ban, and we cannot expand oil and gas production if we have an emissions cap. So I'm asking you to help us with the convincing. Make sure that the Government of Canada understands what's at stake here and what you want and what you need. Anything less than success means failing to act for Canada.
Okay, but just how united are the premiers on pipelines? Just last week, BC's energy minister said that a pipeline to the BC coast would be impractical. So to talk about this, we're now reaching out to former BC cabinet minister Jas Johal, these days the host of the Jas Johal Show on CKNW Radio in Vancouver. Jas, always good to see you. Thank you for joining us.
Good to see you as well, and looking forward to the conversation.
Me too, because there seems to be this big disconnect, because with the Western Premiers meeting back in May, here was Premier Eby joining his counterparts. They send out a joint communique. They stated their support for energy corridors, a pipeline from the BC coast to Hudson's Bay in Manitoba, possibly Grays Bay as well in Nunavut. But then these signals from the BC government that seems to suggest they are having second thoughts. What's happening here?
I would call the response from the BC government, the NDP government, as a soft no. It's not a hard no, it's a soft no. And the key argument the BC government's making at this particular point is, yes, I know there are aspirations for another pipeline, but we've been fighting over a Northern Gateway, which didn't go forward, TMX pipeline, which did go forward, but significant cost to Canadian taxpayers, that let's make sure we have enough supply getting through the TMX pipeline. We can send as much oil as we possibly can before we start talking about yet another pipeline. The argument that the Premier Eby and his government are making is, look, we have no private sector promoter talking about wanting to build a pipeline. Is there a market? I'm talking about a market for a private sector company to actually build this pipeline that can make fiscal sense. I mean, we were originally going to make TMX pipeline, or the private sector was, for about $5 billion. The final numbers came out to $35 billion, with taxpayers holding the bag on that one. And we are not at this point in sending full capacity of oil through that pipeline. That probably won't happen until 2026. So what the government's saying here is, say, wait a minute here. We see a private sector partner. We're happy to sit with them and talk with them and move forward if we can. But if it's just elected officials saying, darn it, we want a pipeline, well, you know what? Here's a soft no for you at this particular point. So you got to have some actual players here to talk about this issue, number one, and to drive it forward. Secondly, there's still has to be significant consultation with First Nations communities if it's going to go through the northern part of British Columbia. There's significant opposition to it. Last time Northern Gateway was proposed, we have a tanker ban. Basically, oil tankers cannot traverse waters north from the northern tip of Vancouver Island all the way to the Alaska border. So we've got that challenge as well. So the BC government hasn't necessarily said a hard no, but it's a soft no at this particular point. And that's where I think this is going to sit until we see a private sector partner. Now, the BC government does have some solutions to say, look, let's dredge the Burrard Inlet. That's here in Vancouver. So those large Aframax tankers actually carry this oil, can actually carry a full load, so we can actually have better use of the TMX pipeline. We can actually ship more oil with the TMX pipeline that we already have. So we're willing to talk about dredging of Burrard Inlet. We're willing to talk about other issues where we can actually move, mining products to Asia, fast-tracking mining here in British Columbia when it comes to critical minerals. The government also says they want to push harder in regards to the expansion of wind and solar here in British Columbia as well, which is part part of the plan here for the BC government. So there are plans the BC government is selling and wanting to move forward on, but at this point, it is a soft no to the Alberta government and many other premiers until they see a private sector proponent proposing a project.
Well, to that, as we just said, Premier Smith is now speaking with oil companies looking to secure some type of proposal, presumably to present to the BC government. But even if that happens, Jas, you mentioned it a little bit, I think you referenced it a bit when you talk about Indigenous consultation. What is the appetite amongst British Columbians for a pipeline? Is this solely the NDP government that is hesitant about it, or is this generally British Columbians that are hesitant about it?
I think this is a different NDP government. The NDP government that was in opposition opposed the Site C hydroelectric dam, which in power they approved. They certainly spoke against LNG when they were in opposition, but guess what? They approved the $36 billion LNG Canada pipeline. So if there's a deal to be had on the table, they'll look at it. But once again, the core issue that you've raised here is First Nations communities. The building of the TMX pipeline went through First Nations communities. There is significant First Nations participation in that TMX pipeline. So yes, it can be built. We've proven that with the TMX pipeline. But if it's going to be a northern route, that's a whole different level of consultation that's going to take time. And remember, the LNG Canada project that was approved in northwestern British Columbia, that's natural gas. That was a different type of fossil fuel, and the local population, First Nations and non-First Nations, had to be educated about that. But moving bitumen through the areas of Kitimat and northwestern British Columbia is a whole different conversation. That area is kind of, I would compare to like the fjords of Finland, and there's significant First Nations community involvement there, and you've got to sit down with them, consult with them, and talk to them. But ultimately, British Columbians also will remind Albertans that we carry the full risk here. If there is one spill here, you are ruining the waterways for generations in that corner of the province. You're not going to have that risk with natural gas. Hence, natural gas got through. We built the pipeline. The LNG Canada shipment to Asia will probably begin in the next few months right here from British Columbia. The TMX pipeline, significant safety issues when it comes to moving those tankers through Burrard Inlet here in Metro Vancouver. We've got world-class safety precautions that we do take. I think that is wonderful. But to convince First Nations and non-First Nations communities that they should be moving bitumen through northwestern British Columbia, that's a different conversation. And if you're going to have it, let's have it, but let's start with a private sector partner willing to put their hand up, willing to do the consultation. And then and only then, I think, will the BC government start looking at this. And so it's easy to say, we don't like Donald Trump, let's build pipelines and sell stuff to Asia. But until you get into the details, especially with local populations, that's where the difficulty lies. So it's going to be a lot tougher than some people think it's going to be. I actually think that if you're going to do it, if you're going to build a pipeline, let's build the pipeline right next to TMX pipeline. Let's just go parallel down the way, all the way, because we already have a route already. Let's twin the TMX pipeline. That's a much easier route, I believe, if we're going to look at another pipeline rather than going through northern British Columbia. So there's a lot of ways we can do this, but there has to be a private sector proponent willing to advocate for it and put money down for it.
I hate to say this, I only have a minute, but I do want to ask you before we're done then, Jas, the Alberta Premier has basically raised this idea that if a pipeline's not built, there will be national unity implications. Is that part of the discussion at all or concern in British Columbia?
Well, if you're going to sit down and talk to British Columbians, as I said, who are taking the complete risk of a spill on their waterways, you can't put a gun to our head and say, well, you better say yes, or we may have a separatist vote. Well, so be it. Go for it. We're not going to change. How does that change? How does that get more oil to Asia? I mean, how does that help your province by having a separatist vote? I don't understand how that's going to help your cause when it is to move more fossil fuels. I'm not sure I'm sure that helps, and I'm not sure that's going to convince British Columbians either. So let's sit down and talk about this. We built the TMX pipeline. The federal government, taxpayers paid for it. You can say yes in this province. We've said yes to TMX. We've said to natural gas and LNG. Hopefully, we can expand it even further in regards to LNG. But you can't put a gun to the head of our government and the people of British Columbia and say, build it or we're going to have a separatist vote. It doesn't work that way.
Jas Johal, as we said off top, always an interesting conversation. Thank you for that. Appreciate the time.
Thank you.
Well, time now for a look at what else happened in politics today.
We also have certain values that are important to us, and when it comes to human rights, when it comes to standing up and protecting Canadian citizens on our soil, but also ensuring that that freedom exists around the world, that's a message that we should be passing along to both Prime Minister Modi as well as the Crown Prince, that these are things that are important for us as Canada, and I think Canadians expect us to stand up for.
Diplomacy means talking to people face to face, and I think this is a very important opportunity for Canada to engage with India. There's no excuse for the very serious allegations around extrajudicial killing, but that means that we need to engage India in those conversations, make sure that they do cooperate in the investigations that are taking place.
Well, that was the Parliamentary Secretary for the Minister of International Trade, Yasser Naqvi. Before him, Liberal MP Karina Gould, expressing differing points of views now that Prime Minister Mark Carney has invited India's Prime Minister and the Saudi Crown Prince to next week's meeting at the G7. Carney has been getting pushback on those invitations. In India's case alone, that country identified by the Oak Commission as a perpetrator of foreign interference in Canada, and agents of that country accused of murdering Canadian Harjit Singh Nijjar on Canadian soil. Also of note,
these are two leaders in a hurry to get things done that they believe are absolutely critical. And yes, the pace is, even for Washington, the pace is unprecedented.
Well, that's U.S. Ambassador Pete Hoekstra today addressing the Canadian Club in Ottawa. And at that luncheon, the ambassador said the U.S. president is anxious to get a new economic and security pact with Canada, adding a breakthrough could happen at next week's meeting at the G7 in Kananaskis. This, as the CBC reported today, that a document with proposals has been going back and forth from Ottawa to Washington. Okay, well, let's get back to the G7 and Donald Trump's attendance. Ben Rowswell is a former Canadian diplomat. He served this country for many years, including serving as ambassador to Venezuela. These days, he's now convener of the Circle for Democratic Solidarity. Ben, thanks for joining the program again.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
So listen, a lot to talk about because, you know, the gathering in Kananaskis next week is already proving to be controversial, beginning with the attendance of Donald Trump. We just spoke to former MP Charlie Angus. He wants Canadians to raise their voices, essentially, short of disinviting the U.S. president. He wants Canadians to express their concerns about what is happening south of the border. So I'll begin there. Should Canada and other members of the G7 be making any kind of statement about the actions that we're seeing in the United States right now?
The G7 is a group of liberal democracies. This is what makes us effective as an international grouping. It's that ability to come together around shared interests and shared values, the shared way that we see the world. And so when one of our countries acts in a way that's not consistent with the principles of democracy, I do think it's appropriate. Now, it probably wouldn't be in the group announcement that's made, which is called the communique. That's the main output of any G7 summit. Obviously, that would require the United States to criticize itself. So this is probably not the moment. But what's happening in the United States is extremely worrisome, not just for American citizens and the basic human rights that are under threat now, but also for America's partnership with the rest of the world. It's been predicated on a system of government that we share, that we had shared up until recently. And now that that's no longer the case, it does place the international relationships the United States have in question. And I do think that should be made explicit.
Made explicit. I'm wondering about the discussion of, Charlie was talking about calling it the G6, everyone but the United States, because I wonder for the G6 then, how important is this meeting for the democratic world? Because, the last time we spoke, you noted the fact that the United States is walking away from its traditional role as leader and defender of liberal democratic values and order. So what opportunities does this meeting in Kananaskis then present for the other countries of the G7?
So there's a tremendously high stakes for the cohesion of liberal democracies and our ability to make decisions together. We assure our security by working together with other liberal democracies. We assure our prosperity by working together. So the capacity of those 6 plus the European Commission, which actually still means 7. The capacity that we have as liberal democracies to keep working together is absolutely essential. Donald Trump may walk out of the summit. That's what he did last time when he was at a summit hosted by Canada. We need to anticipate that and be able to continue to take decisions of the remaining liberal democratic countries together. So in that sense, I do think it's essential that those countries maintain their ability to work together, and that will be a key test for the success of the Kananaskis Summit.
Yeah, a key test, as you say. So what then do you make of the very fact that, for example, Narendra Modi is invited to attend, the Indian Prime Minister, because, you know, India is the world's 4th or 5th largest economy in the world. But is it problematic that Prime Minister Modi has been invited while India stands accused of harassing Canadian citizens on Canadian soil and agents of that country, you know, accused of murder in this country in Harjit Singh Nijjar?
Well, I should say that the criminal investigation does continue, and that Prime Minister Carney announced that he was able to extract that concession from the Indian government, that there will actually be law enforcement cooperation, something that India had previously refused. They'd refused to talk to the RCMP or to even receive some of the evidence that had been that had come forward. So there was that. Now, this is extremely serious. I mean, it's so rare in international relations for one country to be accused of murdering the citizens of another on its own soil that it can never be minimized. That's got to be taken extremely seriously. But the fact that Prime Minister Modi has been invited into coming, I think, is actually a reflection that the stakes for Canada and for Canadians are even higher now that we have the United States breaking from our ranks. The fundamental pillars of Canada's prosperity and sovereignty, the grouping of liberal democratic states and the extremely tight embrace that we've had for 80 years is coming apart. And in order for the remaining liberal democracies to be able to effectively take decisions together, we need to be able to present a common front when we're approaching other major powers. And that's, I think, what's really at stake in the invitation to Modi. It's not to say, you know, we recognize you as a liberal democracy along as our side, because it's not a liberal democracy. India itself shows some worrying signs of authoritarian rule, but it is a major world power. And if we are going to combine our forces as liberal democratic countries and economies, we need to be able to speak with one voice to India, to the United States, and I should say, you know, to some of the other countries that are also invited to attend the G7 summit.
Yeah, you say other countries, and of course I'm thinking about Saudi Arabia and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, because that's an invitation that's been extended and also proving to be controversial. Talk to us about that invitation and what the G7 needs to be doing there.
So the G7 has an economic agenda as well as a political agenda, and at the top of the economic agenda is energy security, and that would be the conversation to have with Saudi Arabia. I think the more significant discussions that will happen will be those with fellow liberal democracies. So I'm extremely pleased that Mexico has agreed to come. I hope this puts an end to the really short-sighted and kind of foolish suggestions that somehow we should jettison our relationship with Mexico and pursue a bilateral deal with the United States. That would be exactly what President Trump wants us to do, which is to divide us and conquer us. So hopefully we can repair some of the damage done to the Canadian relationship with Mexico because of the reimposition of visas. If we could remove those visas, even better, because we really do need to have Mexico in our corner in some of the struggles ahead. Well, I should also point out that Prime Minister Albanese, freshly re-elected after opposing some of the hostile moves by the American government against the Australian economy as well, will be coming there. So some similarities in the kind of political situation between Australia and Canada, an opportunity to develop some new bonds. And we have the president of South Africa coming shortly after he suffered a humiliation in the White House. And I think this is an opportunity for the liberal democratic countries of the world to show our solidarity with South Africa and our rejection of the way that President Ramaphosa was treated by President Trump.
So a lot to be watching for as the world leaders gather in Kananaskis. Ben, always appreciate the time. Thank you for this.
Always a pleasure.
And that is our program for this Wednesday. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. Primetime Politics is back tomorrow evening. Until then, take care.